Hit subscribe and the bell icon to discover amazing historical stories with us every week. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of our villa at Liternum, near Cumae. I am Cornelia, daughter of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, CAB, the man who defeated Hannibal and saved Rome from the greatest threat it had ever faced. Yet here in this coastal retreat, far from the ungrateful city he had served so faithfully, my father had chosen to spend his final years in voluntary exile. As I walked through the corridors of our home that morning, I could hear the excited voices of my children echoing from the gardens. Little Sempronia, barely 9 years old, was chasing her 5-year-old brother Tiberius through the olive groves, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the melancholy that seemed to permeate these walls. It was their first visit to their grandfather's estate, and their innocent joy brought a warmth to this place that had been absent for too long. The villa at Liternum was magnificent, as befitted a man who had brought such glory to Rome. Built in the Greek style that my father so admired, it featured colonnaded courtyards, elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from Homer, and gardens that rivaled those of any patrician mansion in the capital. Yet for all its beauty, it felt more like a gilded cage than a home. Here, surrounded by his books, his memories, and his bitter disappointment in the city he had saved, the great Scipio Africanus had withdrawn from the world. I remember that particular morning because it marked the beginning of an important conversation, one that would illuminate for the historian Polybius the true character of my father. Polybius had arrived several days earlier, ostensibly to gather material for his histories of Rome's rise to power, but I knew he came seeking something more personal, to understand the man behind the legend, the flesh and blood reality of the general who had humbled Carthage and made Rome master of the Mediterranean. My father's daily routine at Liternum was as rigid as any military campaign. Each morning, dressed in his toga, the white wool draped with the precision of a man who had worn senatorial purple, he would walk the perimeter of our estate. This was not merely exercise, but a kind of sacred ritual. He moved with the same deliberate pace he had once used to inspect his legions before battle, his graying hair perfectly combed back, his bearing still straight despite the weight of his years and disappointments. The villa's grounds extended for several hundred acres, encompassing olive groves, vineyards, and formal gardens laid out in geometric patterns that spoke of order and control. A high wall surrounded the entire property. Not for defense. What enemy would dare attack the home of Scipio Africanus? But for privacy. Beyond those walls lay the world that had wounded him so deeply, the Rome that had questioned his integrity and forced him into this self-imposed exile. I often watched him during these morning walks, my heart aching for the pain I knew he carried. Here was a man who had crossed into Africa when no Roman dared, who had outmaneuvered and outfought the greatest military genius of the age, who had brought Hannibal to his knees at Zama and secured Rome's dominance over the ancient world. Yet, in his final years, petty politicians and jealous rivals had accused him of accepting bribes, of profiting from his conquests. Rather than dignify their accusations with a defense, he had simply walked away from the city he had saved. The servants at Liternum were devoted to my father with an intensity that bordered on worship. They were mostly Greeks, scholars, artists, and craftsmen who appreciated his love of Hellenic culture. Under his roof, they found not just employment, but genuine respect for their learning and talents. My father conversed with them in fluent Greek, discussing philosophy, poetry, and the great works of literature that lined his private study. That study, his Times Tablinum Times as he called it, using the traditional Roman term, was his sanctuary within a sanctuary. No one, not even I, was permitted to enter without invitation. There, surrounded by scrolls and codices, he spent his afternoons writing. What he wrote, none of us knew for certain. Perhaps memoirs of his campaigns, or philosophical reflections on power and its corruptions, or letters to distant friends who still honored his name. The mystery of those private hours added another layer to the complex portrait of a man who had become something of an enigma even to his own family. The contrast between my father's public reputation and his private melancholy was stark. Throughout the Roman world, his name was spoken with reverence. Veterans of his campaigns told stories of his tactical brilliance, his personal courage, his care for his soldiers' welfare. But here at Liternum, away from the adulation of the crowds, I saw the toll that greatness had taken on the man himself. He rarely spoke of his military victories, though the walls of our villa were decorated with trophies from his campaigns. Captured Carthaginian standards, suits of armor taken from defeated generals, maps showing the extent of his conquests. These artifacts seemed to hold little meaning for him now. They were relics of a past he had deliberately abandoned. When visitors came seeking to hear tales of his triumphs, he would listen politely, but contribute little beyond the most basic facts. The bitterness of his exile was not directed at Rome itself, but at the particular men who had driven him from public life. Marcus Cato the Elder, that stern moralist who saw corruption everywhere except in his own rigid prejudices, had been particularly venomous in his attacks on my father's character. Other senators, jealous of his popularity and resentful of his Greek affectations, had joined the chorus of criticism. They could not forgive him for being greater than they were, for achieving victories that would be remembered when their own petty maneuvering was forgotten. As I prepared the villa for Polybius's visit that morning, I reflected on how much my father had sacrificed for Rome. He had given his youth to military service, his middle years to dangerous campaigns in hostile lands, and his mature wisdom to the governance of an empire. In return, he had received suspicion, ingratitude, and ultimately exile. Yet even in his bitterness, he remained fundamentally Roman in his dignity and his refusal to seek revenge against those who had wronged him. The sound of footsteps on marble announced the approach of another day's routine. Soon, my father would emerge from his chambers, immaculate in his toga. Polybius would accompany me as I showed my children around their grandfather's domain, and later, after the children were settled for the night, we would gather in the sacred space of my father's study for a conversation that would reveal truths about Scipio Africanus that no public chronicle could capture. But that morning, as I watched Sempronia and Tiberius play among the olive trees, I could not have imagined that I was about to witness something that would change forever how I understood the man who had shaped not just my life, but the destiny of Rome itself. The sound of distant voices, carried on the morning breeze, would soon shatter the careful tranquility my father had built around himself at Liternum. Scipio's Last Triumph, Part 2. Polybius and the Weight of Memory. The afternoon had settled into that particular stillness that came to Liternum during the heat of the day. Even the cicadas seemed to pause their endless chorus as I made my way to my father's study, where Polybius waited. The Greek historian had spent the morning with me and the children, touring the estate with an eye that missed nothing. The expensive marble imported from Greece, the carefully tended gardens that rivaled any in Rome, the subtle symbols of military triumph woven into every architectural detail. Polybius was younger than I had expected, perhaps 40 years of age, with the lean build of a man who had known both scholarship and warfare. He had been taken to Rome as a political hostage after the defeat of the Achaean League, but his learning and charm had transformed captivity into opportunity. Now he moved among the Roman elite as an honored guest rather than a prisoner, gathering material for what would become the definitive history of Rome's rise to world dominance. As we entered the tablinum, I felt the familiar weight of my father's presence. Even in his absence, the room was magnificent yet somehow melancholy. Walls lined with scrolls and codices, tables covered with maps showing the extent of Roman conquests, and scattered papers bearing my father's careful handwriting in both Latin and Greek. A bronze bust of Alexander the Great gazed down from a niche, while captured Carthaginian weapons served as grim decoration. Your father's reputation precedes him even into this exile, Polybius said, settling into the chair my father had indicated for guests. But I sense there is much more to understand about Publius Cornelius Scipio than what the public chronicles tell us. I nodded, pouring wine from an amphora that bore the seal of our finest vineyards. The vintage was from the year of Zama, my father's greatest triumph, though he rarely spoke of it now. The man who defeated Hannibal is not the same man who lives in this villa, I replied carefully. Victory changes people, as does ingratitude. Tell me about him. Polybius leaned forward with the intensity that marked all truly passionate scholars, not the general, not the conqueror, but the father, the man who has raised such a remarkable daughter. I felt heat rise in my cheeks at his compliment, but forced myself to focus on the purpose of his visit. My father was shaped by war from his earliest years, I began. He was not yet 20 when he saved his own father's life at the Battle of Ticinus, riding into combat against Hannibal's cavalry to rescue a wounded consul. That act of courage defined him, not just the bravery, but the willingness to risk everything for duty. The memories came flooding back as I spoke. Stories I had heard countless times from veterans of his campaigns, accounts of battles fought in distant Spain and Africa, tales of a young Roman who had dared to take the war to Carthage itself, when older, more cautious men counseled defense. He was barely 25 when the Senate gave him command in Spain, I continued. His father and uncle had both died fighting Hannibal's brothers there. Everyone expected him to fail. He was too young, too inexperienced, facing seasoned Carthaginian generals who had been winning battles since before he was born. Instead, he captured New Carthage in a single day and drove the enemy from the entire peninsula. Polybius nodded, making notes on a wax tablet. The sources I have consulted speak of innovative tactics, of a general who could adapt and learn from his enemies. But what drove him? What made Scipio different from other Roman commanders? I paused, considering how to explain something I myself was still trying to understand. My father believed in Rome's destiny, I said finally, not just its right to rule, but its responsibility to bring order and civilization to the world. He saw himself as an instrument of fate, chosen by the gods to fulfill a greater purpose than personal glory. Yet he also embraced Greek culture in a way that made many Romans uncomfortable, Polybius observed. His love of philosophy, literature, the arts, these were not typical interests for a Roman general of his generation. No, I agreed, and it cost him dearly in his later years. Men like Cato could not understand how someone could be both Roman and cosmopolitan. Both a patriot and a citizen of the world, they saw his Greek sympathies as evidence of corruption, being somehow tainted by foreign influence. The afternoon light streaming through the windows began to take on that golden quality that marked the approach of evening. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of the villa's routine, servants preparing the evening meal, my children playing in the courtyard, the methodical work of maintaining a great household continuing despite the weight of our conversation. I have read accounts of his final campaigns in Africa, Polybius said. The careful planning, the diplomatic preparations, the psychological warfare against Hannibal himself. But what was he like during those years? How did it feel to know that the fate of Rome rested on his shoulders? I smiled sadly, remembering the letters he had sent home during those distant campaigns. He was confident, but not arrogant. He understood that he was facing the greatest military mind of the age, and he prepared accordingly. Every decision was calculated, every move planned 3 steps ahead, but beneath the careful strategy, he carried an enormous burden of responsibility. The Battle of Zama, Polybius said quietly, the moment when everything hung in the balance. I was barely 16 when news of the victory reached Rome. I replied. The city went mad with celebration, people dancing in the streets, sacrifices at every temple, wine flowing like water. My father was hailed as the savior of Rome, the second Romulus, but when he returned, I saw what the victory had cost him. How so? I struggled to find the right words. He had defeated his greatest enemy, but in doing so, he had become something he never wanted to be, a figure of such prominence that lesser men could not help but resent him. The very magnitude of his achievement made him a threat to the established order. Senators who had cowered in Rome while he fought Hannibal suddenly found the courage to question his integrity. Polybius set down his stylus and looked at me directly, and yet he chose exile rather than fight these accusations. He chose dignity, I corrected. My father could have rallied the people to his cause. They still adored him, still remembered who had saved them from Hannibal's threat. He could have used his military connections, his wealth, his reputation to destroy his enemies. Instead, he simply walked away. Why? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Why does a man who has conquered the world choose retreat over battle? Why does a general who never lost an engagement surrender without a fight? Because, I said finally, he understood that Rome was more important than any individual, even himself. To fight would have meant civil war, chaos, the destruction of everything he had spent his life defending. So he came here to Liternum, to this beautiful prison, and let his enemies have their petty triumph. As I spoke these words, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, my father returning from his afternoon walk through the estate. Soon he would join us, and Polybius would see for himself the man behind the legend. But first, I had one more thing to tell the historian. My father's greatest victory was not Zama, I said as the footsteps grew closer. It was not even the conquest of Spain or the defeat of Hannibal. His greatest victory was choosing honor over power, principle over revenge. That is the truth I want you to include in your history. That Scipio Africanus was great, not just as a conqueror, but as a man. My father entered his study with the measured gait of a man who had once commanded legions, even in his exile, even in the privacy of his own home. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus maintained the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and obedience. His hair, now silver white and carefully combed back from his forehead, caught the late afternoon light streaming through the window. The lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into foreign suns, across battlefields where the fate of nations hung in the balance. "Polybius," he said, extending his hand in the Roman manner to our guest, "I trust my daughter has been entertaining you with suitable tales of domestic tranquility." The Greek historian rose immediately, clearly impressed despite himself by the physical presence of the man he had come to interview. "Your daughter speaks of many things, General, but domestic tranquility is not among them. She has been telling me about duty, sacrifice, and the price of greatness." My father's smile was brief but genuine. Cornelia has always possessed more wisdom than her years should allow. It is a trait she inherited from her mother. He settled into his customary chair, a simple piece despite the wealth evident throughout the villa. "But you have not come to Liternum to discuss my family. You wish to understand how Rome conquered the world. I wish to understand how Scipio conquered Hannibal," Polybius corrected. "The mechanics of empire are well documented. The character of the men who built that empire, that is what future generations will truly want to know." For a moment, my father said nothing, his gaze drifting to the window that overlooked our estate's vineyards. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory that seemed to fill the room. "You want to know about Hannibal?" he said. "Everyone always wants to know about Hannibal, as if defeating him was some kind of miracle, some intervention of the gods, rather than the result of careful planning and absolute commitment to victory. Was it not both?" Polybius asked carefully. "The sources speak of dreams, of divine inspiration, of a young general who seemed guided by fate itself." My father's laugh was dry. "The gods help those who help themselves, young scholar. Yes, I dreamed of victory, but I also studied every battle Hannibal had ever fought, learned from every mistake my predecessors had made. When I crossed into Africa, I knew my enemy better than he knew himself. I watched this exchange with fascination, seeing my father in a role he had largely abandoned since coming to Liternum, that of teacher, mentor, the voice of hard-won experience, passing knowledge to the next generation. It reminded me of the man he had been before bitterness and disappointment had driven him into exile. "Tell me about the decision to invade Africa," Polybius pressed. "Rome had been fighting defensively for nearly 2 decades. What made you believe that carrying the war to Carthage itself would succeed where other strategies had failed?" My father leaned back in his chair, his fingers automatically finding the old wound scar on his left shoulder, a souvenir from the siege of New Carthage. Though he rarely spoke of such personal details of his campaigns, because I understood something that the Senate, in its collective wisdom, had failed to grasp, he replied. Hannibal was not invincible. He was isolated, cut off from reinforcements, dependent on Italian allies who were beginning to question their loyalty to a losing cause. But as long as he remained in Italy, as long as he could move freely and choose his battles, he remained dangerous. So you forced him to come to you. I forced him to fight on ground of my choosing, with an army he had not trained, supported by allies he did not trust. At Zama, Hannibal was not the same general who had crossed the Alps. He was desperate, fighting to save not just his own career but the very existence of Carthage as an independent power. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. One of our household slaves, a Greek named Menander who served as my father's secretary, entered bearing a tray of refreshments. As he set out honey cakes and more wine, I noticed how he moved around my father with the careful reverence of someone who truly understood the magnitude of the man he served. "General," Menander said quietly in Greek, "the afternoon correspondence has arrived from the city. Shall I prepare responses to the usual inquiries?" My father waved dismissively. "Tomorrow, Menander, we have more important matters to discuss today." As the secretary withdrew, Polybius looked intrigued. "You maintain correspondence with Rome?" "Veterans write," my father said simply. "Old soldiers seeking my opinion on this campaign or that political development. Citizens who remember better days and wish to express their regrets about recent events. I answer when courtesy demands it. But I have no interest in the daily gossip of the forum." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and I saw Polybius make a note on his tablet. This was exactly the kind of personal detail that would bring his historical account to life. The great general in exile, still revered by common soldiers but rejected by the very politicians he had served. "Do you ever regret your decision to leave Rome?" the historian asked boldly. My father was quiet for a long moment, absently turning the signet ring on his right hand, the ring bearing his personal seal, the one he had worn when signing the peace treaty that ended the Second Punic War and made Rome undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. "I regret many things," he said finally. "I regret that Rome's victory over Carthage has bred arrogance rather than wisdom. I regret that the same senators who begged me to save them from Hannibal later questioned my honor for political advantage. I regret that my own success has made me a symbol of everything that frightens small men about the possibility of greatness." He paused, looking directly at Polybius. "But I do not regret coming to Liternum. Here, at least, I can remember who I once was without having to pretend to be something I never wanted to become." "And what did you never want to become?" Polybius asked. "A king," my father replied without hesitation. "A dictator, a man who places his own power above the institutions that made Rome great. I could have been Caesar a century before Caesar was born. The soldiers would have followed me. The people would have cheered, and the Republic would have died." The weight of this admission settled over the room like a shroud. Here was the ultimate revelation. Not just that Scipio Africanus had chosen exile over political warfare, but that he had rejected the very real possibility of supreme power in order to preserve the system he had sworn to defend. As the shadows lengthened and evening approached, I realized that Polybius was witnessing something extraordinary. The true measure of my father's greatness, revealed not in his conquests, but in his restraint, not in what he had seized, but in what he had willingly surrendered. The morning that would change everything began like any other. At our villa in Liternum, my father had completed his ritual walk around the estate. The servants had swept the pathways clean, as they did every dawn, and the familiar rhythm of our exile continued unchanged. But as I would soon learn, fate was already moving toward us across the Campanian countryside, carried by armed men who had no idea they were about to encounter legend. I was in the eastern courtyard with my children when I first heard the voices. Harsh, unfamiliar sounds that cut through the peaceful morning like swords through silk. Sempronia was showing her little brother how to identify different types of flowers in our garden. Their innocent chatter, a sweet counterpoint to the harsher realities of our world. But these new voices carried menace, the kind of rough edge that spoke of men accustomed to violence and desperate for gain. "Mama," Sempronia said, looking up from the rosebush she had been examining. "Who are those men?" I moved to the window and felt my blood turn cold. Approaching our villa was a band of perhaps 20 armed men, brigands from their appearance, carrying a mixture of weapons ranging from crude clubs to military swords that had probably been stolen from battlefields or taken from murdered travelers. They moved with the confident swagger of predators who had grown bold from easy successes against defenseless victims. For months, we had heard reports of increased bandit activity throughout the region. The end of the Second Punic War had left many veterans without employment, while the disruption of traditional trade routes had created economic hardship that drove desperate men to crime. Our neighbors had repeatedly warned us to strengthen our defenses, to hire more guards, to call upon Rome for military protection. But my father had refused all such suggestions. "Any show of force would bring attention from that Rome I have chosen to leave behind," he had said when the subject was raised. "I will not give my enemies in the Senate an excuse to claim I am building a private army at Liternum." Now, watching the bandits approach our gates, I realized how dangerously naive that position had been. These men cared nothing for political considerations or the reputation of Scipio Africanus. They saw only a wealthy villa, isolated from immediate help, defended by servants rather than soldiers. To them, we represented opportunity, a chance for plunder without significant risk. I gathered my children quickly, ushering them toward the interior of the house. "Stay with Nurse," I told them, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fear that was beginning to claw at my heart. "Do not come out until I call for you." Racing to find my mother, I discovered she had already seen the approaching threat from her chamber window. Pomponia, daughter of a consul and wife of the great Scipio, had faced many crises during her husband's military campaigns, but never anything like this. We were not soldiers. We were a family at peace, unprepared for violence. "Where is your father?" she asked, her usual composure cracking slightly. "In his study, writing," I replied. "Mother, we must arm the household slaves? Barricade the doors?" "No," the voice came from behind us, calm and authoritative. My father had emerged from his tablinum, still wearing his writing toga, a stylus still in his hand. "Open the gates." For a moment, neither my mother nor I could speak. Had the isolation and disappointment of exile finally affected his mind? Could he truly be contemplating surrendering his family to brigands without any attempt at resistance? "Father," I began carefully, "these are not Roman citizens seeking audience. They are armed criminals who mean us harm. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I had not witnessed since his return from Africa, years before. The cold calculation of a general preparing for battle. I know exactly what they are, daughter, and they are about to learn exactly who I am. By now, the bandits had reached our gates and were testing their strength with increasing boldness. The bronze-reinforced wood, beautifully decorated but not designed to withstand siege, groaned under their assault. Our household slaves, Greeks and other non-Romans who served us faithfully but had no military training, looked to my father with expressions of terror and confusion. "Dominus," said our head gardener, an elderly man named Castor, who had served our family for 20 years. "Shall we send word to the magistrates in Cumae? Perhaps they could." "There is no time," my father replied, moving toward the gates with that same deliberate pace he used for his daily walks. "Besides, this is not a matter for magistrates. This is a matter of honor." I watched in amazement as he stopped before the trembling household staff. Here were 24 men and women who had never seen combat, facing armed brigands who killed for profit. Yet when my father spoke to them, his voice carried the same quiet authority that had once commanded the legions of Rome. "Fear is natural," he told them. "But remember who you serve. Remember the household you belong to. You are not merely slaves. You are members of the family of Scipio Africanus, and that name still means something in this world." I saw shoulders straighten, saw resolution replace panic in faces that had moments before been frozen with terror. This was the magic my father had always possessed, the ability to inspire ordinary people to extraordinary courage, simply by reminding them of their own dignity. The pounding on the gates grew more violent, accompanied now by shouted demands and crude threats. The bandits were growing impatient, confident that fear would soon overwhelm any resistance we might attempt. They had no idea that they were about to face a man who had stared down Hannibal himself across the plain of Zama. "Open the gates," my father repeated, this time addressing the slaves directly. Old Castor, his weathered hands shaking slightly, moved toward the great bronze latches that secured our entrance. As he began to work the mechanisms, I felt time slow to the pace of nightmare. Everything we had built at Liternum, our peace, our safety, our carefully constructed refuge from an ungrateful world, was about to be destroyed by the greed of common criminals. But as the gates began to swing open and I saw my father step forward to meet our enemies, I realized that I was about to witness something that would define the rest of my life. A demonstration of what true courage looked like when stripped of armies, allies, and all external support. I was about to see Scipio Africanus as he truly was. Not the conqueror of Carthage, not the savior of Rome, but simply a man who refused to surrender his dignity regardless of the cost. The bronze gates of our villa swung open with a sound like thunder, revealing my father standing alone in the entrance. Behind him, our household slaves clustered in the courtyard, their faces a mixture of terror and awe, as they watched their master prepare to face armed brigands with nothing but his presence and his reputation. The morning sun, rising behind the estate's olive groves, cast his shadow long across the threshold, a shadow that seemed to reach toward the band of criminals like an accusation for a heartbeat that felt like eternity. No one moved. The bandits, who had been shouting threats and demands just moments before, fell silent as they found themselves face to face with a figure from legend. Even roughened by years of violence and hardened by desperation, these men recognized something in my father's bearing that gave them pause. This was not the cowering villa owner they had expected, not the wealthy merchant or aging politician who would beg for his life and offer gold for mercy. The bandit leader, a hulking man with arms like tree trunks and scars that spoke of many battles, stepped forward from the group. His sword was Roman military issue, probably taken from some unfortunate legionnaire in a roadside ambush. The blade caught the morning light as he raised it, but something in my father's steady gaze made him hesitate before completing the threatening gesture. "We want your gold, old man," the brigand said, his voice rougher than gravel. "Your stores, your wine, your women. Give us what we want, and maybe we'll let you live to enjoy your next sunrise." My father took a step forward. He moved without haste, without fear, with the same calm authority he had once displayed when reviewing troops before battle. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the space between them, not shouted, not pleading, but simply stated with the absolute certainty of a man who had never doubted his own authority. "I am Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus," he said. "What do you want?" The effect was immediate and profound. The name hit the bandits like a physical blow, causing several to take involuntary steps backward. Others looked around uncertainly, as if suddenly realizing they had walked into something far beyond their understanding. The leader's sword arm dropped to his side, his aggressive posture crumbling as the implications of that name sank in. Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal, the savior of Rome, the general whose name was spoken with reverence from Gaul to Egypt, whose tactical innovations were studied by military commanders throughout the known world. These brigands, for all their desperation and violence, were still Romans. They had grown up hearing the stories, singing the songs, learning the legends of the man who now stood before them in simple mourning clothes. "You can't be," whispered one of the younger bandits, a boy who probably should have been learning a trade instead of robbing travelers. "Scipio Africanus he's a legend?" my father asked quietly.
A myth?
"A name from stories told around campfires?" He took another step forward, and this time it was the bandits who retreated. "I am flesh and blood. As you see, I wake each morning. I break my fast. I tend to my household. But I am also the man who crossed into Africa when Rome trembled at Hannibal's name. I am the general who met the greatest military mind of our age on the plain of Zama and sent him home in defeat." The transformation in the brigands was remarkable to witness. Men who had approached our villa with the confident swagger of predators now stood hunched and uncertain, their weapons hanging loose in nerveless fingers. Some actually began to back away, though their leader remained frozen in place, trapped between his criminal purpose and the overwhelming presence of living legend. We heard. The leader began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "We heard you were in exile. Disgraced." "Exile? Yes," my father replied calmly. "Disgrace? That is for history to judge. I chose to leave Rome rather than see it torn apart by civil war. I chose this peaceful villa over the bitter warfare of politics. But I am still Scipio. I am still the man who commanded 20 legions and broke the power of Carthage." One of the bandits, An older man whose military bearing suggested he was a veteran himself suddenly dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. The crude club clattered on the stone pathway as he pressed his forehead to the ground in the gesture of complete submission that Roman soldiers reserved for emperors and gods. "Forgive us," he gasped. "We didn't know. We never would have. I served under your command in Africa. 3rd Cohort, 2nd Legion, at Ilipa, at Utica, at the final battle. You saved my life at Zama when the Carthaginian cavalry broke through our line." The effect was contagious. One by one, the other brigands began to lower their weapons, to kneel, to prostrate themselves before the man they had come to rob. The transformation was complete. Predators had become suppliants. Criminals had remembered they were Romans. Chaos had given way to order at the simple speaking of a name. My father stood unmoved throughout this display, neither gloating over his enemy's submission nor showing mercy to men who had threatened his family. He simply waited, allowing the full weight of his presence to settle over the scene until every bandit knelt in the dust before our villa's gates. He said finally, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded armies, "You came seeking easy plunder from a defenseless household. Instead, you have found Scipio Africanus in his exile. I could have you crucified as common thieves. The law would support me, and no magistrate would question my actions. Or I could invoke the old military discipline and have you decimated for threatening Roman citizens." The kneeling men shuddered at these words, knowing that either fate would mean a slow, agonizing death. They had gambled everything on a simple robbery and instead found themselves at the mercy of Rome's greatest general, a man whose reputation for both brilliance and ruthlessness was known throughout the civilized world. "But I will not," my father continued. "You have seen me as you wished. You have learned who dwells in this villa. Now go and remember what you have witnessed here. Tell others what happened when common brigands dared to threaten the household of Scipio Africanus." The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Without another word, the bandits began to rise and back away, their eyes never leaving my father's face. They moved like men in a dream, unable to believe they had been granted not just their lives but their freedom. The veteran who had recognized him was the last to leave, tears streaming down his weathered face as he stumbled toward the road. As the last of them disappeared beyond the olive groves, my father turned and walked back toward the villa. His shoulders, which had been straight and proud throughout the confrontation, suddenly sagged with exhaustion. The effort of maintaining his legendary presence, of being Scipio Africanus rather than simply a tired old man in exile, had cost him more than any physical battle. "Father," I began, moving toward him, but he held up a hand to stop me. "I am well, daughter," he said quietly, though his voice carried a note of infinite sadness. "That was my last triumph, I think, the final victory of Scipio Africanus." As we walked together toward the house, I realized I had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the power of reputation and legend, but the terrible burden such greatness placed on the man who carried it. My father had defeated his enemies not through force of arms, but through the weight of his own name, the accumulated power of a lifetime of achievements. But in doing so, he had perhaps exhausted the last reserves of the strength that had once conquered the world. What do you think about this historical event? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The silence that followed the bandits' departure was profound, as if the very air around our villa needed time to recover from the weight of what had just transpired. I found my father in the eastern courtyard, seated on the marble bench where he often came to think during the quiet hours of the day. His hands rested on his knees, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked every one of his 60-plus years. "That man who recognized you," I said, settling beside him. "He served under your command?" My father nodded slowly. "At Ilipa, when we broke Hasdrubal's line and drove the Carthaginians from Spain forever. He was barely 20 then, a boy from some farming village who had never been farther from home than the nearest market town. I remember him because he wept when we captured the Carthaginian standards, not from fear or relief, but from pride at being part of something greater than himself. The irony was bitter and obvious. A veteran of Rome's greatest victories, reduced to highway robbery in the countryside he had once helped to secure. The peace my father had won at such cost had brought prosperity to some, but devastation to others. Soldiers suddenly, without purpose, without livelihood, without the structure that military life had provided. "The wars are over," I said quietly, "but the warriors remain." "Yes," my father replied, "and Rome has not yet learned how to care for the men who won her empire. They fight and bleed and conquer, and then when peace comes, they are dismissed to find their own way in a world that has no use for their skills." We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the morning sun climb higher over the olive groves. From somewhere in the villa came the sound of my children's laughter, innocent joy untouched by the morning's drama, the blessed ignorance of youth. My mother's voice could be heard giving instructions to the household staff, life resuming its normal rhythms as if armed brigands had not just threatened our very existence. "When you spoke your name," I said finally, "I saw something I had never witnessed before. Not just recognition, but fear, reverence. What was it about those men that made them react so strongly?" My father was quiet for so long that I wondered if he had heard the question. When he finally answered, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from his very soul. "They saw a myth made flesh," he said. "For 20 years, they have heard stories of Scipio Africanus, the young general who dared to attack Carthage's homeland, the tactical genius who outsmarted Hannibal himself, the hero who saved Rome from her greatest enemy. In their minds, I had become more than human, a figure from legend walking among mortals." "But you are human," I protested. "You bleed, you doubt, you feel pain like any other man." "Of course I do," he agreed, "but that is not what they needed to see this morning. They needed to see the legend, the myth, the terrible power of a name that has conquered the world. And so I gave them what they needed. I became Scipio Africanus, one final time." The weight of this revelation settled over me like a shroud. My father had not simply faced down armed criminals. He had summoned the last reserves of his legendary presence, drawing upon decades of accumulated reputation to achieve victory without violence. But the effort had clearly exhausted something vital within him. "You called it your last triumph," I said. "What did you mean?" He turned to look at me directly, and in his eyes I saw a depth of sadness that made my heart ache. "Because it was, daughter. Today I used the power of my name, the weight of my reputation, the fear and respect that the world holds for Scipio Africanus. But I am an old man in exile, and such power is not limitless. Each time I draw upon it, there is less remaining for the next crisis. You defeated them without raising a sword, without calling for help, without bloodshed. I pointed out, surely that represents the highest form of victory. Perhaps, he said, or perhaps it represents the last gasps of a dying god. The world is changing, Cornelia. New men are rising in Rome, men who have never known the terror of Hannibal's threat, who see my generation as relics of a bygone age. They care nothing for our victories, our sacrifices, our service to the Republic. They judge us only by our usefulness to their present ambitions. The bitterness in his voice was palpable, and I realized that the morning's confrontation had reopened wounds that had never properly healed. The brigand's recognition of his name had reminded him of what he had lost. Not just political power or social position, but the simple respect of the citizens he had spent his life defending. History will remember you differently, I said with conviction I hoped was genuine. Future generations will study your campaigns, learn from your innovations, honor your achievements. The petty politicians who drove you from Rome will be forgotten footnotes, while the name of Scipio Africanus will live forever. He smiled sadly, reaching over to pat my hand with the gentle affection of a father who loved his daughter but doubted her. Optimism. You may be right, he said, but I will not live to see such justice. I am 53 years old, Cornelia, and I feel like I have already lived 3 lifetimes. The boy who saved his father at Ticinus, the young general who conquered Spain, the consul who defeated Hannibal, they are all ghosts now, memories preserved in the stories others tell. No, I said firmly, surprising myself with my vehemence, they are not ghosts. They live in you, in your children, in every Roman who walks safely because of what you accomplished. That bandit who recognized you, he may have fallen to robbery, but he remembered. He remembered who you were, what you did, why your name still matters. My father considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps that is enough, to be remembered not just as a name in the histories, but as a living presence in the hearts of men who shared the glory and paid the price of Rome's rise to greatness. As the morning wore on, and the immediate shock of the bandits' visit began to fade, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what I had witnessed. My father's reputation had indeed saved us, but at a cost I was only beginning to understand. He had drawn upon reserves of legendary power that could never be replenished, had played the role of mythic hero one final time in the humble setting of our country villa. Later that day, when Polybius returned from his explorations of the local countryside, I would have a new story to tell him, not just about the great general's military campaigns or political setbacks, but about the day when legend became flesh and saved a family through the simple power of speaking a name that had conquered the world. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the marble floors of our villa, I found myself once again in my father's study with Polybius. The Greek historian had returned from his afternoon explorations of the countryside to discover that he had missed what might have been the most remarkable incident in the long, eventful life of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. As I recounted the morning's events, the approach of the bandits, my father's calm response, the extraordinary moment when armed criminals prostrated themselves before the power of a legendary name, I watched Polybius's expression shift from skepticism to amazement to something approaching awe. "You mean to tell me," he said when I had finished my account, "that your father faced down 20 armed brigands with nothing but his reputation and the force of his personality?" "I saw it with my own eyes," I replied. "Men who had come to rob and perhaps kill us, left without taking so much as a copper coin. They departed not as defeated enemies, but as pilgrims who had been granted audience with a living God." Polybius made careful notes on his wax tablet, but I could see his mind struggling to process the implications of what I was telling him. Here was material for his histories, unlike anything he had encountered before. Not the mechanics of battle or the strategies of campaign, but the raw power of legend made manifest in the physical world. "Where is your father now?" he asked. "I should very much like to speak with him about this morning's events." I gestured toward the window, where we could see my father's silhouette in the moonlit garden. He had been walking the grounds since sunset, following paths he knew by heart through olive groves and flower beds that had become his entire world. There was something different about his movements tonight. Not the purposeful stride of his usual evening exercise, but the slow, contemplative pace of a man wrestling with profound questions. "He has been troubled since the bandits left," I explained. "I think the encounter reminded him of things he would prefer to forget, or perhaps made him confront truths he has been avoiding." Polybius set aside his writing materials and leaned forward intently. "What kinds of truths?" I considered how to put into words something I was only beginning to understand myself. "The burden of being larger than life," I said finally, "of being Scipio Africanus, rather than simply my father. This morning he had to summon that legendary presence one more time, and I think it may have been the last time he possessed the strength to do so." "Surely his reputation remains as powerful as ever," Polybius protested. "The bandits' reaction proves that his name still carries tremendous weight throughout the Roman world." "His reputation, yes," I agreed. "But reputation is not the same thing as the man who bears it. My father has been carrying the weight of his own legend for more than 20 years now. Every public appearance, every official function, every encounter with citizens or foreign dignitaries, he has had to be Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal, the savior of Rome. The effort of maintaining such a persona, year after year, has slowly consumed the private man beneath." Through the window, we watched my father pause beside the fountain at the center of our garden. The structure was decorated with scenes from his African campaigns, carved reliefs showing Roman eagles triumphant over Carthaginian elephants, artistic representations of the victory at Zama that had made him famous throughout the civilized world. In the pale moonlight, the marble figures seemed to move, shadows dancing across stone faces locked forever in expressions of conquest and defeat. "He told me this morning that today's encounter was his last triumph," I continued. "I think he meant that he has finally exhausted the reserves of legendary power that have sustained him through all these years of exile and disappointment." Polybius was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the implications of what I was telling him. As a historian, he was accustomed to dealing with the public actions of great men, their political decisions, their military strategies, their impact on the course of events. But here was something far more personal and perhaps more important: the private cost of public greatness, the toll that legend takes on the human being who must embody it. "In my research," he said finally, I have interviewed many of the men who served under your father's command. To a man, they speak of him with a reverence that borders on worship. They describe a general who seemed touched by divine favor, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to inspire courage in his soldiers and fear in his enemies. Are you suggesting that this legendary presence was somehow artificial? Not artificial, I corrected, but constructed, maintained through conscious effort and enormous personal cost. My father became the legend that Rome needed him to be, but in doing so, he sacrificed much of the man he might have been if he had been free to choose his own path. The sound of footsteps on marble announced my father's return to the villa. Through the study door, I heard him speaking quietly to one of the household slaves about tomorrow's arrangements. Mundane details of domestic life that seemed almost surreal, given the morning's dramatic events. This was the paradox of his existence. The man who had shaped the destiny of nations now concerned himself with the management of olive groves and the ordering of wine for his modest household. A few minutes later, he joined us in the study, moving with the careful dignity that had become second nature to him over the decades. But I noticed new lines around his eyes, a subtle change in his bearing that spoke of profound exhaustion, the effort of being Scipio Africanus for those crucial moments with the bandits had clearly taken a toll that would not be easily recovered. "Polybius," he said, settling into his customary chair, "I trust my daughter has been entertaining you with suitable tales of domestic drama. She has been telling me about this morning's encounter." The historian replied carefully, "I confess, I am having difficulty believing that such an extraordinary event actually occurred." My father's smile was weary but genuine. "Then you understand how I felt when it was happening. For a few moments, I was forced to step outside the comfortable routine of my exile and remember who I once was, or at least who the world believed me to be." The bandit's reaction suggests that the world still believes you to be exactly what you always were, Polybius observed. "Perhaps," my father replied, "but I am not the man who crossed into Africa 20 years ago, full of righteous purpose and absolute confidence in Rome's destiny. That young general died somewhere between Zama and the Senate's accusations of corruption. What remains is an old man who happens to bear a famous name. Yet that name still has power," I interjected. This morning proved that beyond question. My father looked at me with an expression that mixed love with profound sadness. "Yes, daughter, the name retains its power, but names are just words, and words eventually fade. What matters is what lies beneath them, the character, the principles, the commitment to something greater than oneself. Those things are harder to maintain than reputation, but they are also more lasting." As the evening wore on, and our conversation continued, I began to understand that the day's events had marked not just my father's last triumph, but also perhaps his final peace with the complex legacy he would leave behind. He had spent years in bitter exile, resentful of Rome's ingratitude and wounded by the attacks on his character. But this morning's encounter with the bandits had reminded him that his true monument was not political position or public honors, but the impact he had made on the hearts and minds of ordinary people throughout the Roman world. The young soldier who had recognized him and wept at their reunion would carry that memory for the rest of his life, sharing the story with his children and grandchildren. The other bandits would return to their communities with tales of meeting legend in the flesh, of witnessing the power that great deeds and noble character could wield even in exile and disgrace. These memories would outlive any bronze statue or marble inscription, carrying the essence of Scipio Africanus forward into future generations, long after the man himself had returned to dust. If you enjoyed learning about this piece of history, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more fascinating stories, and let me know in the comments which historical period you'd like to explore next. 3 days after the bandits' visit, my father died peacefully in his sleep. I found him at dawn when I came to check on him, as had become my custom during his final years. He lay in the simple bed he had chosen for his exile, his face calm and composed, as if he had simply decided that his work in this world was finished. On the table beside him lay a letter he had been writing, his final message to the ungrateful city he had served and saved. "I have lived as a Roman," the letter read in his careful handwriting, "and I die as one. Let no man say that Scipio Africanus forgot his duty to the Republic, even when the Republic chose to forget its duty to him. I go to join my ancestors with honor intact and conscience clear. Rome will endure, as she always has. But let her remember that greatness requires not just ambition, but sacrifice. Not just power, but wisdom in its use." Polybius wept when I showed him these final words. The Greek historian had remained at Liternum, hoping to gather more material for his histories, but instead found himself witness to the end of an era. Together, we sat in my father's study as the morning sun streamed through windows that would never again frame his familiar silhouette, and tried to make sense of a life that had encompassed such triumph and such tragedy. "He was the last of his generation," Polybius said quietly. "The men who fought Hannibal, who saved Rome from her greatest peril, who built an empire that spans the known world, when they are gone, who will remember what it cost?" I thought of my children, still too young to fully understand that they were the grandchildren of legend. Someday, I would tell them stories of their grandfather, not just the public tales of military victory and political controversy, but the private moments that revealed the man beneath the myth. They would learn about his morning walks around the estate, his love of Greek poetry, his devotion to family, his quiet dignity in the face of ingratitude and exile. The funeral, when it came, was a study in contrasts that would have amused my father had he been alive to witness it. Despite his years in exile, despite the bitter circumstances that had driven him from Rome, delegations came from across the Republic to pay their respects. Veterans of his campaigns arrived travel-stained and weeping, bearing standards they had carried in battles whose names would echo through history. Senators who had once questioned his integrity now delivered elaborate eulogies, finding it safe to praise a dead hero they had been unwilling to defend when he lived. But the most meaningful tribute came from an unexpected source. As the funeral procession made its way to the family tomb, a group of rough-looking men appeared along the roadside. I recognized them immediately. They were the bandits who had faced my father in what proved to be his final confrontation with the wider world. They stood in respectful silence as the bier passed, their heads bowed, their weapons laid aside in a gesture of honor that no amount of senatorial oratory could match. The bandit leader, the scarred giant who had led his men to our villa seeking easy plunder, stepped forward as we approached. In his hands he carried a simple crown woven from olive branches, the kind of modest tribute that Greek cities awarded to their heroes. Without speaking, he placed it on my father's funeral bier. and stepped back into the crowd. Later, when the formal ceremonies were complete, and the political dignitaries had returned to Rome with their consciences eased and their reputations enhanced by association with the dead hero, I found myself back in the villa at Liternum with Polybius. The house felt empty now, not just because of my father's absence, but because something vital had gone out of the world with his passing. "I have been thinking about what he said," Polybius told me as we sat in the garden where my father had spent his final hours. "About the encounter with the bandits being his last triumph. I think I understand now what he meant." "Tell me," I said, for I was still struggling to make sense of those final days. "Your father spent his life winning victories for Rome. Military victories, diplomatic victories, strategic victories that expanded the Republic's power and secured its future. But his final victory was different. It was personal, private, a triumph of character over circumstance. When he faced those bandits, he wasn't fighting for Rome or for empire or for political advantage. He was simply being who he truly was, and that was enough." I considered this, remembering the look in my father's eyes after the bandits departed. Not the satisfaction of a general who had won a clever battle, but the quiet peace of a man who had finally reconciled himself to his own legacy. "He conquered the world," I said finally. "But his greatest conquest was himself. All those years of exile, of bitterness and disappointment, and in the end he chose dignity over revenge, honor over power. That may indeed have been his greatest triumph." Polybius nodded, making notes that would eventually find their way into the histories that would preserve my father's memory for future generations. But I knew that the truest monument to Scipio Africanus would not be found in books or inscriptions or marble statues. It would live in the hearts and minds of people like that bandit who had served under his command, who had fallen from grace, but still remembered what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. In the months that followed, as I prepared to leave Liternum and return to Rome with my children, I often walked the same paths my father had taken during his exile. The olive groves still flourished. The gardens still bloomed. The villa still stood as a testament to Roman prosperity and Greek aesthetic sense. But without his presence, without the daily ritual of his morning walks and afternoon contemplations, the place had become simply a beautiful house rather than a shrine to living greatness. My son Tiberius, though still only 5 years old, sometimes asked about his grandfather. "Why did people bow down to him, Mama?" he would say. "Why did those bad men run away when he spoke his name?" "Because," I would tell him, "your grandfather was a great man, not because he was rich or powerful or feared, but because he understood what it meant to serve something larger than himself. He spent his life protecting Rome and her people, and even when Rome forgot to be grateful, he never forgot his duty." These conversations with my son reminded me of the most important lesson my father had taught me, not through words, but through the example of his life. True greatness, I came to understand, was not measured by the size of one's victories or the scope of one's power, but by the willingness to sacrifice personal advantage for the common good. My father had conquered Hannibal and saved Rome from destruction, but his greatest achievement was simpler and more profound. He had shown that it was possible to remain human in the face of superhuman expectations, to maintain dignity in defeat, and to choose honor over convenience, even when no one was watching. As I prepared to close the villa and return to the capital city my father had served so faithfully and left so reluctantly, I found myself thinking about the future generations who would study his life and try to understand the man behind the legend. They would learn about his tactical innovations, his diplomatic skills, his role in making Rome master of the Mediterranean world. But if I had succeeded in sharing the true story with Polybius, they might also learn something more important: that Scipio Africanus's greatest triumph was not the defeat of Carthage's armies, but the victory of character over circumstance that had defined his final years. That, I believed, would be a legacy worthy of the man who had shown 20 armed brigands the power of a name honestly earned and courageously carried, even unto death.